Think life is tough today? Try surviving in medieval times, and you'd be begging for the comforts of the modern world within hours. We've become soft compared to the brutal daily realities of the past. The hardships people faced then would leave you in complete disbelief. Let's take a look at medieval food. Trust me, it's enough to make you appreciate even the most basic meal in the 21st century. First off, toss aside any Hollywood images of lavish feasts with massive turkey legs and elaborate spreads. For the average person, meals were far from exciting. They were plain, often unappetizing, and sometimes downright hazardous to your health. The bulk of a peasant's diet was something called pottage, a bland, watery stew made from whatever vegetables they could grow. It simmered in the same pot for days and was the medieval equivalent of mom's leftover stew. Only instead of hidden vegetables, you might find a few weevils or bits of dirt mixed in. Bread was a staple for nearly everyone in the medieval world, but it wasn't the soft, sliced loaves we're used to today. Instead, it was heavy, dense, and often packed with all kinds of unwanted extras. The flour was ground using stone mills, which would often leave bits of rock in the mix. People in those days didn't have stronger teeth because of superior genetics. They had to chew through dough that could have doubled as a rock-based workout. And here's something truly terrifying. Much of that bread contained ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on rye. Ergot poisoning could cause hallucinations, intense burning sensations, and in some cases, death. Some historians even think that ergot poisoning might have played a role in fueling witch hunt hysteria, since entire towns would experience mass hallucinations at the same time. Imagine thinking your neighbor was a witch, when in reality it was just your local baker's equipment that needed a good cleaning. Meat was a rare treat for most people, and when they did get it, it was often nearly rotten since there was no refrigeration to keep it fresh. To mask the taste of spoilage, they'd use strong spices if they could afford them. Otherwise, they'd just hold their nose and hope for the best. The medieval version of the 5-second rule was more like the 5-day rule. The worst part? You couldn't wash down this questionable food with water because drinking it could make you sick. Most water sources were contaminated with human waste and other harmful substances. Instead, everyone, kids included, drank beer or ale, which, though weaker than what we have today, was safer than water due to the brewing process killing germs. Studies show the average medieval peasant consumed around 8 pints of ale a day, and children as young as 5 would drink it with every meal. Medieval kids didn't need fake IDs to drink, they needed them to get water instead. Fish was a common food, but it was usually preserved by drying or salting since fresh fish spoiled quickly. Coastal folks might get fresh fish, but for those inland, fish often arrived days or even weeks old, and the smell was unbearable. If your stomach isn't already turning, let's move on to another medieval horror, going to the bathroom. For most people, it meant using a chamber pot, basically a bowl or bucket kept under the bed. Once filled, it had to be emptied, either by the person themselves or by someone hired to collect it. And where did it go? Usually, right out the window into the street below. The medieval version of "look out below" wasn't about falling objects, but falling feces. People in towns would shout "Garde elle" as a warning, derived from the French phrase "garde à l'eau," meaning watch out for the water, though the water they meant was something far less pleasant. This practice became so routine that in some medieval cities, the rule was you could only throw waste from windows after 10 at night. If you were fortunate enough to visit a castle, you might come across a garderobe, a hole in a stone seat that sent waste directly down the castle wall. At Dover Castle, archaeologists discovered a garderobe that dropped waste almost 70 feet. While kings and queens may have had thrones, their toilets were little more than holes with a draft. For those who couldn't wait to get home to their chamber pot, the options were grim. Public areas often had designated spots where people relieved themselves, essentially creating what we would now call open sewers. In London, common privies were built over rivers, but they were few and far between. The task of collecting and disposing of human waste fell to unfortunate workers known as gong farmers. These brave individuals were responsible for emptying cesspits and hauling waste outside city walls. They could only work at night, and the stench was so overpowering that they weren't allowed in public places. Despite the dreadful conditions, gong farmers were paid remarkably well, about 4 times what an average laborer earned. The smell of medieval cities was infamous. The River Thames in London was so polluted with waste that it was described as a monster of stink. Toilet paper? That wasn't a thing. People used whatever they could find. Leaves, moss, their left hand, or, if they were wealthy, pieces of wool or hemp. The Romans had once used sponges on sticks, rinsing them in vinegar or salt water, but that knowledge was mostly forgotten by medieval times. After a long day of drinking ale to avoid waterborne illness and finding no proper place to relieve yourself, you'd be ready to trade it all for the comforts of the 21st century. But the bathroom situation was just one of many harsh realities that made medieval life a constant struggle for survival. Forget about the romantic image of being a noble knight or a beautiful maiden in a castle. In reality, most medieval people worked grueling, back-breaking jobs from dawn till dusk, earning just enough to survive. The majority were peasant farmers working the land owned by nobles. Their routine was simple but exhausting. Wake up at dawn, work the fields until sunset, collapse into bed, and repeat. A typical farmer would plow fields with wooden tools pulled by oxen, plant seeds by hand, and harvest crops using basic sickles. During harvest season, peasants often worked 16-hour days in the blistering sun, burning over 4,000 calories daily from sheer physical labor. Medieval farmers didn't need gyms. They were just trying to stay alive. For those who weren't farming, trades and crafts provided alternative work, though they came with their own brutal challenges. Blacksmiths spent their days in smoky forges, inhaling toxic fumes and risking severe burns and eye injuries. Tanners, who transformed animal hides into leather, worked with urine and harmful chemicals that stained their skin yellow and left them with a stench that followed them everywhere. If you wanted to become a skilled tradesperson, you had to start young. Apprenticeships often began at age 7, with children sent to live with a master craftsman. These young apprentices worked 6 or 7 days a week for up to 14 years before they could hope to become journeymen. Medieval career counselors had a simple flowchart. Can you lift heavy things? If yes, farmer. If no, early death. Some jobs were made for the desperate and poor. Link boys were children tasked with carrying torches to light the path for wealthy folks at night. Pure finders collected dog feces to sell to tanners. The pay for most of these jobs was barely enough to survive. A day laborer in medieval England might earn 1 or 2 pennies a day, just enough to buy a couple of loaves of bread. There was no such thing as minimum wage. The idea was simply to make enough to stay alive long enough to finish your work. With such physically taxing labor and poor diets, your body would wear out fast. Disease was rampant, medicine was almost non-existent, and what passed for healthcare today would be considered torture. Medieval WebMD had one diagnosis for every ailment. You're probably going to die. A simple cold or flu, easily treatable today, could be fatal. Without knowledge of germs or infections, people believed illness was caused by bad air or an imbalance in the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Got a fever? Time for bloodletting, where they'd cut open a vein and drain blood into a bowl. Medieval doctors had one fix for everything. Too much blood? Let me take care of that for you. Leeches were another popular treatment in medieval medicine. These blood-sucking creatures were applied to the skin to draw out what was thought to be bad blood. Some medical texts even recommended using up to 70 leeches at once for certain conditions. The mortality rate from disease was horrendous. About 30% of children didn't survive past age 5, and the average life expectancy ranged from just 30 to 40 years. The bubonic plague wiped out roughly 50% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Dental problems were rampant, with no proper toothbrushes or knowledge of dental hygiene. Tooth decay was common, and medieval dentists didn't need to schedule appointments. They just waited for someone to scream loud enough to be heard through town. Even the medicines available were often lethal. Mercury was a go-to treatment for everything, from skin conditions to syphilis, with no warnings about side effects, because the side effect was always, it might kill you faster than the disease. The real kicker? Many diseases spread due to the medieval lack of hygiene. Their idea of hand sanitizer was wiping their hands on their already filthy clothes, basically like trying to clean a muddy shoe with a dirty sock. And even if you somehow survived the medical treatments, life in the Middle Ages had plenty of other ways to make survival difficult. Justice back then wasn't just blind. It was harsh, random, and often downright cruel. The legal system was a nightmare, operating on principles that would make any modern lawyer cringe. Laws varied wildly from one town to another. What was legal in one place could land you in a dungeon just 5 miles away. There were no standardized legal codes, so most people had no idea what was illegal until they were accused of breaking it. As for medieval Miranda rights, you had the right to be punished and the right to beg for mercy. Good luck with that. Punishments often didn't fit the crime, and minor offenses like stealing food when you were starving could lead to having your hand chopped off. Life in the Middle Ages was a brutal game of survival, where each day was a challenge to make it through. With no real health care, a justice system that had no regard for fairness, and constant threats from disease, it was a time when the odds were stacked against you from birth to death. The hardships of medieval life weren't just about physical labor. They were about navigating a world where survival was uncertain and suffering was constant. Whether it was a horrific medical treatment or a cruel legal system, the Middle Ages gave you plenty of reasons to wish for a fast-forward button to modern times. In medieval England, over 200 crimes were punishable by death, including seemingly minor offenses like chopping down a tree in the king's forest or stealing items worth more than 12 pence. The legal process bore little resemblance to modern court systems. If you were accused, proving your innocence often meant enduring a trial by ordeal. One infamous method required the accused to carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 feet. If the burn wounds healed cleanly within 3 days, you were deemed innocent. If they became infected, which was likely without modern medicine, you were guilty. This was their primitive version of a lie detector. If God didn't protect you from harm, you must have been lying. Another brutal method was trial by water. The accused was bound and thrown into a river or lake. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and executed. The belief was that pure water would reject the guilty. It was a no-win scenario. Either you drowned or were sentenced to death. For those found guilty, execution methods were intentionally gruesome to serve as a warning. Hanging was considered relatively merciful. The most severe punishment, reserved for crimes like treason, was drawing and quartering. This horrific process involved being dragged through the streets, hanged until near death, disemboweled alive, beheaded, and finally cut into 4 parts. Public executions were treated like major social gatherings. With limited entertainment, people flocked to these spectacles, often bringing food and drinks as if attending a fair. While commoners faced harsh and unforgiving justice, nobles lived by a different set of rules. Accused aristocrats could demand trial by combat and hire a champion to fight for them. Wealthier offenders often avoided punishment by paying blood money to victims' families. In stark contrast, poor defendants had few options and little chance of avoiding brutal punishment. What about jails? In medieval times, prisons weren't used for long-term punishment. They were just grim holding areas until your real sentence, often torture or execution, was carried out. These dungeons were filthy, overcrowded, and dark, with prisoners chained to walls or left lying on the cold floor. The state didn't feed inmates. If your family didn't bring you food, you starved. Torture was standard, not only as punishment, but to force confessions. Devices like the rack, which pulled limbs from sockets, the Iron Maiden, a spiked coffin, and thumb screws, which crushed fingers, were common. Most people confessed just to end the pain. Confessions that often sealed their fate, leading straight to execution. The system might as well have said, confess or suffer, then suffer anyway. Public humiliation was a common tool for minor crimes. Stocks trapped your head and hands in wood, while crowds pelted you with rotten food, mud, and worse. For women, the ducking stool was a favorite. Argue too much or gossip, and you'd be tied to a chair and dunked underwater repeatedly. Law enforcement wasn't exactly modern either. There were no police forces, just night watchmen, usually old men too frail for real work. Their job was to keep an eye out and shout if something went wrong. If someone yelled, "Stop thief," it relied on a passerby to trip the culprit. Rights weren't read, and you certainly weren't presumed innocent. Once accused, you were basically guilty until proven otherwise, usually by surviving some inhumane trial. Warfare was another brutal part of medieval life. Forget the Hollywood image of chivalrous knights galloping through sunny fields. Real medieval battles were messy, terrifying, and deadly. Wars weren't rare events, they were a constant reality. The 100 Years' War between England and France stretched from 1337 to 1453, 116 years of back-and-forth bloodshed. People didn't just read about war, they lived it, often more than once. For the average villager, war meant destruction, loss, and forced conscription. Glory wasn't guaranteed, death was. And then there was armor. Full-plate armor, that classic knightly look, was incredibly rare and expensive, about as pricey as a modern sports car. Only the wealthiest knights could afford it, equivalent to 2 or 3 years' wages for a skilled worker. Most fighters wore padded gambesons, maybe reinforced with a few metal plates if they were lucky. The dazzling knight in shining armor was the medieval version of a guy showing off a luxury car. Flashy, elite, and probably compensating for something. What about weapons? Swords were prized and expensive, mostly reserved for knights and nobles. The average soldier wielded spears, axes, or repurposed farm tools turned into makeshift weapons. But the most feared tool of war was the longbow, capable of punching through armor at close range. English longbowmen began training in childhood, their bodies twisted over time by the strain of drawing 200-pound bows thousands of times. Medieval battles were beyond brutal. At the Battle of Towton in 1461, around 28,000 men died in just one day, roughly 1% of England's male population. Many never even reached the front lines, freezing to death in the snow before they could fight. And if you were wounded? Infection almost always finished what the blade didn't. For peasants, the battles weren't the worst part. It was what armies did between them. Medieval troops lived off the land, which meant taking food, supplies, and shelter from local villages by force. Crops were burned, livestock slaughtered, and homes destroyed, often by soldiers from both sides. Supporting the troops often meant hoping they'd leave you with something to eat. Sieges were a special kind of nightmare. When an army surrounded a town or castle, those inside slowly starved. During the Siege of Paris in 885, people resorted to eating rats, pets, and eventually one another, and sieges didn't always end quickly. The longest in history, the Siege of Candia, dragged on for an incredible 21 years. Disease killed more than any weapon ever could. Armies were breeding grounds for illness, poor hygiene, dirty water, and too many people packed together. During the Crusades, half of some European forces died from sickness before seeing a single battle. Medical care was crude. Minor cuts got dirt, major ones got last rites. Civilians trapped in war zones had no good options. Fleeing meant risking starvation and bandits. Staying meant facing soldiers who might loot, burn, or kill indiscriminately. Women and children weren't spared either. Chroniclers of the time recorded entire villages wiped out, with no one left behind. If you somehow dodged being drafted into war, escaped starving in a siege, and avoided being trampled by looting soldiers, you'd still be stuck with the misery of everyday medieval life. The stench alone could knock you out. Cities reeked of human waste, spoiled food, sweat, slaughterhouse runoff, and smoke. With no garbage collection, trash was thrown in the streets or into rivers. Butchers dumped animal guts right outside their shops. The smell was so unbearable that people carried pomanders, pouches of herbs, to sniff, like a medieval air freshener. Bathing was rare and feared. People thought it opened the body to disease. Most only bathed a few times a year, if that. In winter, it could be 5 months without a single wash. Head lice were so common that everyone had special combs for them. If your lice situation was not that bad, you were basically dating material. Clothing didn't help your comfort levels. Most people wore itchy wool and rough linen until the fabric literally disintegrated. You probably owned 2 or 3 outfits total, and shoes were just thin leather scraps barely fit for walking. If you think you could at least talk your way through things, think again. Middle English from the 1400s is almost alien to modern ears. Phrases like "Wyatt is thin nama" wouldn't register at all. You'd sound like a time-traveling lunatic. Privacy didn't exist. Families lived in single-room homes where eating, working, and sleeping happened together. Beds were shared, sometimes with strangers or travelers. Even the rich had servants hovering around during personal moments. Entertainment was a luxury. Public executions and animal baiting were the main attractions. Storytelling bards and traveling performers were rare treats. The social structure was locked down tighter than a fortress. Born a peasant? You'd likely die one. About 90% of people were landless laborers working fields for nobles. Changing careers or climbing the ladder was nearly unheard of. Most knowledge came from word of mouth or superstition. People believed in witches, demons, and that eclipses meant the end of the world. Illness was blamed on spirits or cursed stars. Facts came from the village elder if they remembered something similar happening decades ago. News traveled by foot or horse. Messages from another town might take days. Updates from another country took months if they came at all. At this point, you'd be begging for antibiotics, a warm shower, and deodorant. Medieval life wasn't charming, it was survival, and most wouldn't last a single day.